All right, so before we dive into the study tonight, are there anything we need to be praying about this evening? Anybody else? Okay. Jay, do you mind opening us up in prayer? Amen. All right, before we get started, did everybody get the sheet for tonight? Did I miss anybody? Tried to get everybody when they came in. Okay. All right, so before we get started, there was one question that got asked last week that kind of puzzled me because I don't think I was very clear on it. And so I wanted to reiterate, but while we got started, kind of make sure I was more concise in how I answered it. And that Aaron asked, how do we respond if someone says that the story of Isaac and Abraham and Isaac is just a story of divine child abuse? And I won't say that I, brushed it off, but I tried to answer in a couple of ways. Of one, that people that ask those questions generally aren't really asking those questions. They've got some type of ulterior motive, and that I don't get real interested in answering questions for people that have ulterior motives. And so so that was part of the reason I gave the answer I did. But then I realized that I never really actually brought together what I was trying to say. And so how I would actually respond to it if I was going to is I want to be clear on that, and that one, Abraham understood it was a test. We know from the scriptures that Abraham understood that even though God was calling him to go to the mount to sacrifice Isaac, that Abraham's language and the way the story was told and the actions of Abraham, that he understood that even if the sacrifice had to go through, that Isaac would be resurrected. Like there was never a doubt in his mind, or a shred of doubt in his mind, that both him and Isaac were going to walk off that mountain. He never believed that, or that Isaac would be left on the mountain as a dead sacrifice. But also, if you look into the story, and this was the part I left off, Isaac had no idea what was going on. Isaac was never told. Isaac never really felt threatened. Isaac never saw himself as the sacrifice. And so that's how I would answer, is you have those two things, is that Abraham in his test was trusting God, and Isaac himself actually had no idea what was going on. And so he would not have seen it as abuse. And then when we see, the stories of Isaac left over after that from the New Testament, or the Old Testament, it's very clear that, it did not bother Isaac later on. He still maintained his trust in God, and that he understood the context in which he was living. And so before we got into the Day of Atonement, I wanted to clarify that because it goes right in to what we're talking about tonight. And that, the first 5 sessions, we could have really titled this, instead of Jesus in the Old Testament, we could have called it Jesus in Genesis. But I wanted to do Jesus in the Old Testament because if we're going to look at how the Old Testament points to Jesus, we really can't do it without talking about the atonement and how the atonement system works and how the atonement system really pointed to the coming of Jesus. Because often what we do is we look at the Old Testament and we see a God who has sacrifices and requires all of these things of his people. And then people will say, well, that's the God of the Old Testament who is vengeful and is, wanting bloodthirsty and is wanting all of these sacrifices. But then once the New Testament rolls around, you have the God of love, and you have, Jesus coming in and teaching us how to live with each other, and that, it kind of washes away the old system and makes it obsolete and then brings in the new system. But really and truly, if we are going to be people who believe the Bible, who understand and believe in the storyline of Scripture, we don't see Old Testament, New Testament, old God, new God. We see one story that is woven throughout it, and that the Old Testament points to the New Testament, and that the Old Testament ways are just foreshadowing of what are to come in the New Testament, and that the Old Testament helps us be able to understand what happens in the New Testament because the New Testament makes the Old Testament more clearly. And so we see that tonight whenever we're talking about the atonement. And so the reason that I wanted to make sure that we talked about the atonement is to see how the ultimate story, the ultimate miracle in the Bible is, not Jesus changing water into wine or parting the Red Sea, is that Jesus was dead, buried, and rose again. And that is the ultimate miracle of the Bible. And that is all predicted in the Old Testament and in the Levitical systems that are put in place in the Old Testament. That it's not, Jesus coming about and saying, like, how can I use my life to fit into this system? The systems that God put in place in the Old Testament were to point to Jesus. And just as we saw with the other stories, there are specific things that are mentioned that the writers in the New Testament tell us are pointing to Jesus. That whenever we understand the story of Jesus, we can understand the story of the atonement. We can understand all of the Old Testament stories much more clearly. And so that's why I wanted to end this series on the atonement, and why I didn't want to just stay in stories that were in Genesis, because I wanted us to see how the atonement actually points to Jesus. And I think much of this is probably ideas that we are familiar with, especially those who have kind of been around church for a very long time. You'll kind of hear hints of this all over the place. But I want to make sure tonight that as we look at it, we have kind of picked up all of those pieces and put them together so that we have a clear understanding of exactly how the Day of Atonement and the sacrificial systems of the Old Testament are not just, God wanting, goats and bulls to be dead, but are pointing to the coming of Christ and the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And so whenever we talk about the Levitical system and the Day of Atonement, we're going to be talking about specifically from Leviticus chapter 16 tonight. But as I always have done, I want to make sure that I'm very clear about what the typology is and about the things that are pointing to Jesus, the stuff that the New Testament writers look back and say this is the symbol of Jesus in that story. And for Leviticus chapter 16, what we see is that first off, the sacrificial animals that we see here, they point to the sacrifice of Jesus. And so whenever we're reading through the story in just a moment, whenever we see specifically the goats that are mentioned, but also the bulls and the other animals that are mentioned as part of this sacrificial system, we understand that it is about the animals for the people in the Old Testament, but they are seeing very dimly what we see more clearly in the New Testament, is that the sacrificed animals are really just pointing to the ultimate sacrifice that will happen on the cross in the name of Christ and by the works of Christ. And so whenever we talk about the sacrificed animals, we should understand that this is just a picture of the sacrifice that Jesus is going to provide on the cross. And then secondly, it also, the Day of Atonement pointed to the completeness of Jesus' sacrifice. What we're going to see as we read through, and particularly as we get to the end of it, when Moses, as he's recording this, is talking about what all of this system does and what it covers, he is pretty clear that for the time period that the sacrifice was for, it covers all of the household of Israel. It covers all of the people of Israel, not just, one specific group or one specific type of sin. That when we're talking about the Day of Atonement, we are looking at some events that happen that are trying to rectify the issue of sin and trying to overcome the effects of sin and create atonement for the people and in their standing of God. And that the New Testament writers point back to this and say that just as the blood covered, the blood of the animals covered their sins for the year, the blood of Christ covers all things for all eternity. And so those are the two ideas that we're going to be dealing with tonight as we kind of look at this and kind of look at some of the high points of this. Now, as I often do, I want to point out, as I'm teaching on this tonight, we're hitting the high points here because I'm assuming all of y'all want to go eat supper at some point tonight, okay? And so if we could literally go verse by verse and almost word by word through this and really pick it apart and see how just about everything in this chapter has a New Testament parallel. There is the New Testament writers see this chapter as fundamental to understanding of our message as Christians and of the work and sacrifice of Jesus. And so we could really go through and really pick this apart to see exactly how it's used throughout the Old Testament. But rather than doing that, what I want us to do is to see the bigger picture, because, I have been in education long enough that I can tell you that I can stand up here and tell you word by word and verse by verse and get everybody very, very confused, and you won't remember any of it, right? But if I give you the big ideas, it's something that we can always hang our hats on and always remember, whether we're in the middle of a Bible study or whether we're talking to our friends on the street or our neighbors across the fence. It's something that we can always bring back, the big ideas. And so that's why tonight we're looking at the really big ideas of what are here so that we can understand the context, the story, and the flow of everything that is going on here. And so tonight, we're going to focus in on Leviticus chapter 16 is where we're going to focus in at. Now, I want to, point out that as we're looking at the Levitical law here and at this one chapter in verse 16, it comes right in the middle of a whole lot of things that the Israelite people are being commanded to do by God. That there is all types of rules for how they are to live. There is all types of sacrifices and ways that they can clean themselves when certain things happen. It's not all about just how to deal with sin and how to deal with the effects of sin. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the atonement. It's also about just how to make sure that you are a clean person, how to make sure that you set yourselves apart, how to make sure that you are able to live in the world as God would have you to live. Some of it is health codes, some of it is codes that just help people be able to live and to get along with each other and to deal with the problems of sin. But ultimately, what we have to do whenever we're looking at the entire book of Leviticus, when we're looking at this entire book, is that it's very easy for us to look at it because it happens often in the media, particularly those who want to kind of bash Christianity. They go straight to the book of Leviticus. They find one sentence and they say, you don't believe the Bible because you don't do this, right? Or you don't believe the Bible because you don't do X or you don't do Y. And they pick out the one verse that they know is going to get you, right? Because they've seen you do something or they've heard you not say something or something like that. And although some of that can happen, what we have to understand is that the book of Leviticus and its purpose is not just a list of do's and don'ts, right? although it is a list of do's and don'ts, its ultimate purpose is not to say this is what everybody has to do all of the time, but it is to communicate to the body of faith, to the community of people, to the Israelites, that they are a set apart people and that they do things differently. Okay? And so when it talks about things like not having clothing that is made out of two different types of fabric, it is not so much saying that like you must do that or else you're going to get a skin rash. It is saying do this because you are a set apart people who do things differently. When it talks about that you have to be a people who don't intermix with the pagan cultures around you, it's not because God wants the Israelites to look down on the pagan cultures or to have some type of barrier where they think that they are superior to them, but it is saying you are a set apart people, and that anytime you allow something that is not pure, or anytime you allow something that is a foreign substance into the community, you're going to corrupt the whole community. And so it's not about God saying the Israelites are superior, or the Israelites are smarter, or that the Israelites have bigger hearts so they can run faster, or that the Israelites are mighty warriors, or any of that. It is God saying these are the boundaries of what my people do and my people don't do, because you are a set apart people. And when you're a set apart people, you do things differently. Okay? And so that's kind of the overarching kind of theme and idea of the book of Leviticus. But whenever we get to chapter 16 then, what God does is he says you're a set apart people. You're a people who do things differently. And because of that, unlike the Canaanites or unlike the Jezebites or unlike all of these people who look at the world and say, you know, like our real problem is that Baal is not happy, right? That Baal, the one who oversees our crops, he's not happy. And so let's like do some things that's going to make him happy. So let's sacrifice some good steaks on the grill tonight. Like we're just not going to eat. Or we're going to give up our daughters to go and to serve as temple prostitutes and hope that that makes Baal happy so that we can get a good harvest. What God, though, is doing is he's saying we reject all of that he is not a God who is unpredictable. He is not a God who, today he might get angry, but if he, looks down and sees that George is doing something I don't like, or I do like, that's going to make me happy. But if I look over here and Sarah's doing something that I don't like, that's going to make me mad. And so I send a couple of bolts of lightning down and we take care of Sarah, right? That he's saying that's not how I operate. Like that I am the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that ultimately the real problem, the real issue is not that you have made me mad or that you have made me upset, but that our relationship is broken. Like that fundamentally in the Garden of Eden, the relationship between God and his people is broken. And it's not about whether we have a good harvest, although we want to do that. It's not about whether we live a long life, although we want to do that. It's about dealing with the real problems of humanity, which is sin, which is the effects of sin, of breaking that relationship that we had with a holy God. And so while he's talking about, how to, if you look at chapter 15, how to deal with bodily discharges, how to deal with cleaning your house, how to make sure that you have on clothes that are not going to be bad for you, how to keep leprosy from spreading throughout your community. You just have all of these things about how to do it. God says, and now here's how we're going to deal with this problem of sin. Like this is how this problem of sin is going to be dealt with, at least in the short term, until Jesus comes and deals with it once and for all. And so that is called the Day of Atonement. And it would happen once a year, where the chapter we're going to read, these events would happen once a year, where the sins of the people of Israel would be atoned for or would be made right. That God would say for the entire year, everything that happens is going to be dealt with on this one day. So that we can at least try to make it as a people and have a relationship between God and the created order. And so that's where we're at as Moses is recording this. Let's read through Leviticus chapter 16 here. We're going to read the whole thing. And I will give you a warning. If you're like me, you have to read this, and then you have to sit down and think, okay, like, what is he actually saying here? Like, it's like a word salad at points. And you have to kind of go through it and think, all right, let's connect this and this back together, and let's figure out exactly what he is saying. So, if at the end you get to that and you're like, I'm not even really sure what all is in this chapter or what he's saying, I encourage you tonight, read it again whenever you get home. And then tomorrow, read it again. And what you're going to find is, since it's God's word that is intended for all of God's people throughout all of time, what you're going to find is that as you read it, you're going to notice things over and over again that you didn't maybe notice the first time you read it, but you did the third time you read it. And it will start making more sense to you the more you read it and the more you look at it. Because you just start to think about it, you start to make connections, and you kind of start to understand it. But it also, the more you read it, so let's say you read it on Sunday night and again on Monday night and then again on Thursday night, there's a lot of time, right, between Sunday and Thursday. And you find yourself, driving, and you think, well, what was that kind of in the middle? And you start to kind of think about the verses a little bit, and just kind of as you're going about life, you start to make connections in ways that you don't if you don't ever go back and read the pieces of Scripture that are often confusion or that we have to remind ourselves of what is there. And so we're going to start at verse 1. If you would, follow along with me as I read along of these verses of what Moses records here about the Day of Atonement. It says, "The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they drew near to the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil, before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in a cloud over the mercy seat. But in this way Aaron shall come into the holy place, with a bull from the herd for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat, and shall have the linen undergarment on his body. And he shall tie the linen sash around his waist, and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water, and then put them on. And he shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. Then he shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast his lots over the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and another lot for Azel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord, and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azel shall be presented alive before the Lord, to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azel. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. And he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small. And he shall bring it inside the veil, and put the incense on the fire before the Lord. And that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat that is over the testimony, so that he does not die. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat on the east side. And in front of the mercy seat he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering that is for the people, and bring its blood inside the veil, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it over the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat. Thus shall he make atonement for the holy place, because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel, and because of their transgressions, all their sins. And so he shall do for the tent of meeting, which dwells with them in the midst of their uncleanness. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and for his house and for all of the assembly of Israel. Then he shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it, and shall take some of the blood of the bull and some of the blood of the goat and put it on the horns of the altar all around. And he shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times and cleanse it and consecrate it from the uncleanness of the people of Israel. And when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. The goat shall bear all their iniquity on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free in the wilderness. Then Aaron shall come into the tent of meeting and shall take off the linen garments that he put on when he went into the holy place, and shall leave them there. And he shall bathe his body in the water in a holy place, and put on his garments, and come out and offer his burnt offering and the burnt offering of the people, and make atonement for himself and for the people. And the fat of the sin offering he shall burn on the altar. And he who lets the goat go to Azal shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water. And afterward he may come into the camp. And the bull for the sin offering and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought in to make atonement in the holy place, shall be carried outside the camp. Their skin and their flesh and their dung shall be burned up with fire. And he who burns them shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water. And afterward he may come into the camp. And it shall be a statute to you forever, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict yourselves and shall do no work, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. On this day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you. You shall be clean before the Lord from all your sins. It is a Sabbath of solemn rest to you, and you shall afflict yourselves. It is a statute forever. And the priest who is atoned and consecrated as priest in his father's place shall make atonement wearing the holy linen garments. He shall make atonement for the holy sanctuary, and he shall make atonement for the tent of meeting and for the altar. And he shall make atonement for the priest and for all of the people of the assembly. And this shall be a statute forever for you, that atonement may be made for the people of Israel, once in the year, because of all their sins. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him. Now I told you, as you're reading through, you're going to think there's going to be some spots you're like, whoa, right? Like, what in the world is going on here? What we have, though, is a step-by-step guide of how God says on a yearly basis the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, are to deal with the sins that have been committed for that year. Now, let's be clear here. What this is at the very end, you see that God says this is something that happens once a year. And today, this, in fact, if you have a calendar, I think it's on the iPhone, I think, too. And if you have like a paper calendar, it's often noted on that. It's called Yom Kippur, and that's what this is. And in fact, it happens depending, the Hebrew Jewish calendar works a little differently than our calendar does. It usually falls somewhere around the end of September, 1st of October, kind of in that period. It's a high mark on the Jewish calendar. It's a really big deal in Jewish communities. Where, they often go to temple, they do the sacrifices, they do all this. They take days off of work still. It's a big deal in the Jewish community to celebrate Yom Kippur. But it only happens once a year. And if you notice, it covers all of the sins for the people. Now, did you catch where God tells Aaron he's got to take one of the goats, lay his hands on the head of that goat, and name the sins of the people for that year? I want you to imagine that job for just a moment, right? Not only do the people have to confess the ways that they have sinned that year, they have to tell it to Aaron, and then Aaron has to tell it to the goat. Imagine how long that's going to take, right? But it's a symbol, and it shows us how seriously God takes sin and how desperately even God himself wants this relationship between his creation and himself to be restored. That it's not God just sitting up there with a thunderbolt. Like, God really wants this relationship to be restored, because we're just generations. We're not that long compared to how far we are now. We're not that far out of the Garden of Eden, and God is saying, like, let's restore this relationship. Let's do something to restore this relationship. Now, as it starts off in this chapter, what we have is there's two things that are mentioned. One, there is a sin offering, and there is a burnt offering. Now, a burnt offering we were introduced to last week, but I didn't really explain it because I wanted to save it here so we can see how the comparison is. Sin offering is what happens on the Day of Atonement. A burnt offering is more of like a voluntary offering that the people would do to offer something to God as a way of saying, like, we believe in you, we want to offer our earthly goods to you, we want to give our earthly goods to you as a way to show that you are more important than anything that is here. It's much like what we do when we do our tithes and offerings, right? Like, we can talk all day about how the church needs to pay its power bill, so we have to give tithes and offerings, but let's just go ahead and name it. Jesus can pay his own power bill, right? Like, Jesus can make it happen if he needs to. The point of tithes and offerings is for us to, through our action and through our worship, to show God that he is more important than anything on this earth, even our earthly possessions. And so that is the point of the burnt offering, is it's completely voluntary. It is a way for humans to show their devotion to God. Whereas a sin offering is trying to restore that relationship that has been broken by sin. Of saying, God, like, because there has to be punishment, because there is a broken relationship, because of our sin that can only be restored through the shedding of blood, a sin offering is put in place to try to restore that relationship. It is not to show God that he's more important than anything. It is to restore that broken relationship that we have. And so what we see here is there's a couple of types of sin offerings that happen. Is that Aaron first has to offer a sin offering of a bull, and that is done for Aaron and his household. Now, the reason that this is important, and the reason it comes first, is because Aaron, in order for him to be able to go into the Holy of Holies, to be able to offer up the sin offering for the entire Israelite community, for the Hebrew people, he has to have his relationship with God restored and repatched first. And so that's why he has to offer his sacrifice first. Even though as we read through, we see that it's a different animal, but it is much the same process as restoring the relationship of the entire Israelite people. And so I wanted to point that out, but I want us to focus in tonight on not what Aaron has to do to be able to have a path to be able to go into the Holy of Holies to make atonement for the people. But I want us to see what happens when the community at large has to have their sins atoned for. And so as we were reading through, I hope what you noticed is that there are two goats that are commanded. There are two goats that God says Aaron has to deal with, and that he has to do something with. One is slayed while the other one is released. Okay? One is slayed while the other one is released. So the first goat is the one goat slain to represent substitutionary atonement. So the first goat represents substitutionary atonement. Can we all acknowledge tonight that the goats who were the ones who got, the goat rather, on the Day of Atonement that got slain was not the one that lied to their mama? Can we agree with that? Can everybody agree with that? We can all agree with that, right? They weren't the ones who got in an argument with their siblings, right? Or lied to their daddy about having the Corvette out, right? That was not the goat, right? But who is the one that has to suffer the punishment for what the Israelite people did? It's the goat, right? The goat is the one that has to take the punishment for what happens. Now, I want you to just imagine, because if you're like me, like you read this, And you're like, oh, like, okay, Aaron, he picks up the goat, he does his little thing, he lays it and he sprinkles the blood. Have anybody of you tried to have to do away with a goat or an animal? It ain't a clean process, right? There is a struggle with that. And they don't have all the modern technology and knife sharpeners and all that that we do. So I want you to imagine that Aaron, who has just had to do this process with a bull, right? A bull, okay? We ain't talking about a little calf. He just had to do this process with a bull. Now he's got to turn around and he's got to do it again with a goat. Now he has cleaned himself up, as you see there, but physically he is still having to do this, right? And he is still having to struggle. And I think that God put that in there and wants us to think about it because he's really wanting us to understand that, like, whenever we even do what we call little white lies or little sins or little things that nobody thinks anything about, it's still stuff that when the Israelite people did it, they still had to confess it to Aaron. And Aaron still had to struggle because of what they were doing. And so the whole process is built on this idea of substitutionary atonement. That God is building this process that the ones who do the sin, the ones who commit the sins, all the way down from lying to mama and daddy about whether you painted on the wall or not, all the way up to Hitler himself, whatever you're at in all of that, you're not the one having to pay the penalty for your sin. Now, why is that? Why is that? Why is it that God couldn't just say, you know what? Like little Israelite Joey over here, like he's the one that lied. Why can't Aaron just slit his throat? Well, because can imperfect restore a relationship to perfection? Is it even possible for the sinner to pay the debt? And it's not, right? If that was possible in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve sinned, the first sacrifice would not have been an animal that lost its life for them to have garments. God would have just made garments out of their own flesh. But they sinned. They're imperfect. It's absolutely impossible for them to be able to restore that relationship because perfection doesn't come out of imperfection. And so that is why God sets up here that it is this goat who has done nothing wrong that is the one that gets slain. And we see that in verses 15 and 16, where he says that Aaron shall kill the goat of the sin offering that is for the people. So this is for all of the people of Israel, for all of their sins. He brings its blood. Now notice he doesn't bring the entire goat. He just brings the blood into the veil, and then he has to, into the veil of the Holy of Holies, and then he has to sprinkle the blood all over the different spots around the Holy of Holies, just as he did the bull. But then did you catch there's a second goat? And we've already kind of pointed this out, that Aaron has to put his hands on, and he has to confess the sins of the Israelite people, and then that goat gets to go free. Now we would think, if it's me, I'd be like, well, I kind of want to be that second goat, right? Like, don't let that lot fall on me. Like, I want to be the second goat. But do you really? Because what happens with the second goat? It gets pushed out into the wilderness away from everything that it's ever known. And for the rest of its existence, that's where it has to live. Because it is bearing the weight of all of the sins of the Israelite people for that year. It can no longer come in contact with anything related to the Israelites. Do you remember I told you as we were setting up Leviticus, that Leviticus is about God showing how his people are set apart. God showing how his people are different than all of these other people that surround them. And so when Aaron puts his hand on the goat, puts the sins of the people for that year on the goat, as embarrassing as it may be for some of those sins, they get put on the goat. That goat then bears the weight of all of those sins. And since God's people are set apart, those sins have to be pushed out of the community. and that goat can never come back for anything, for any reason. And so really, even though we'd be like, well, I don't know, I kind of like being able to live in the wilderness, the goat's getting pushed out, away from everything it ever knows, has ever known. It doesn't know where its food source is at. It doesn't know where its water source is at. All of those people that it thought were its friends are now gone. And it has to be pushed out because, as Paul tells us at that verse there in 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake, he, meaning God, made him, meaning Jesus, to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. This second goat is the symbol of how God is going to, in the future, because in Leviticus 16, it's still in the future, about how he is going to transfer all of the sins of humanity onto Jesus and send Jesus out into the wilderness. That is why Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. And why at the end he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He is showing how he is this second goat that has been forsaken and pushed out into the wilderness. Because he now has the weight of the sin of the world on him, and he has been broken off from the community of faith. And so when you take these two things together, you see that these goats, when taken together, are pointing to the future coming of what Jesus is going to have to do. Except there is one difference. There is one really big difference. The second goat was released to show the removal of sin. The first goat was slain to represent substitutionary atonement. And the difference is that every year there is another set of goats that have to go through this. Because, as we know from the New Testament, the sacrifice has to take place over and over and over again, because there's only one who's Jesus, who can do it once and for all. Because the sins of the people and the atonement only is good for 1 year, and that has to be done again. When Jesus does this, he is able to break the whole system, because he is the one who knew no sin in any regard. And so the two goats taken together point us to Jesus, with the big change being it's a once and for all sacrifice that no longer has to be repeated. And so that's kind of where the two goats are and how the two goats point us to Jesus. But if you read this, you'll and you read much of the Old Testament, particularly in Leviticus, you may come away asking the question like, why is God so obsessed with the blood? Right? Because I know in my mind, until I kind of realized that, I always thought like the animals were sacrificed and, they were kind of dragged into the Holy of Holies, and that's where they were sacrificed. But if you noticed, it's the blood that makes its way in. The body of the animal is still outside. The blood is what is taken, and the blood is what is sprinkled. Why is it that God seems so preoccupied with blood as part of this process? And in fact, some modern day, I wouldn't really call them scholars, but people who like to talk a lot, point this out. And they say, why is it that God of the Bible is so obsessed with blood? Why is he bloodthirsty? Well, that puts us in the mind that somehow we think that when this blood is sprinkled across the altar or across the Holy of Holies, that God is just kind of drinking it in. But that's not it at all. That's not it at all. The purpose and the usage of blood is because blood it's one of the things, and it's not the only thing, it is one of the things that represents life itself. The first time I ever gave blood, I wanted to give blood, but I was very concerned that they were going to take too much and that I was going to end up in the hospital, right? Because we all know if you lose too much blood, what starts to happen? You're going to die, right? You're going to faint, you're going to die, it's because blood is one of the things in our body that if we without it, there is no way to overcome that, right? We have a couple of other organs that are like that, but blood is the liquid that flows through our body and that represents the surrendered life because of sin. That blood represents the surrendered life, that life is coming out of the goat because of the effects of sin. That when sin comes in, life goes out. And there is one thing the ancient people understood. They didn't know as much as we did about heart cavities and all of these different things about the kidneys and all that. But they knew if you lost your blood, life was coming out of you. And that is what is symbolized there. It's not that God wants to like drink this blood or brought this blood in, but that blood symbolizes and represents that life has been surrendered over because of the effects of sin, which is why the writer of Hebrews has to tell us this, that indeed under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. It's not that God likes to see death. It's that God is reminding us through the sacrificial system that death is the outcome of sin. That death is the outcome of sin. And that without blood, no animal, human, or anybody can survive. And so that is why he says that the shedding of blood is what causes the remission of sin. And that's why Paul writes in Romans 5:16, the free gift is not like the result of that one man's sin. For the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation, but the free gift following many trespasses brought justification. What is Paul saying here? Paul is telling us that we have this free gift of salvation that comes from Jesus to us. When we say free gift, we mean that it's a free gift to us. But you know, the Israelite people would have said that the substitutionary atonement, the atonement that we get every year when Aaron goes into the Holy of Holies, it's a free atonement that we get. All we have to do is we just got to go, meet with Aaron for a little bit, tell him what we did that year. He puts it on the goat. This is free, right? It's great. It's free. There's one thing every economist will tell you. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Because you know who didn't think it was free? The goat. Right? The goat did not think that was free. But it's free to us. Because it wasn't free to Jesus. That's why it's free to us. And so it cost him everything so that we can have this free gift. And that is why Paul there says the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation. He's talking about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden eating off the tree. That is the one trespass that brought condemnation. But how glorious it is that we get a free gift following all of the trespasses we have committed. Now, how do we kind of look at this? If Paul is talking about that one trespass brought condemnation for all of humanity by Adam eating and consuming that fruit, I think that we can all look out and we can even look at our own lives and we can think, you know what, I've done a whole lot worse than eat some fruit off a tree. Like, I've done a lot of bad things, right? Or I know Johnny over here, let me tell you now, I wish all he did was eat off a fruit tree. And so that's what he's saying, is that like we have this one condemnation this one action that brought us condemnation, but think about how glorious it is that when you take in the totality of all of the trespasses of all of humanity over thousands of years, that Jesus' death on the cross, he overcame the result of that sin by his action. And so therefore we have justification. And how glorious it is that his shed blood was so pure. His shed blood was so holy and righteous, that it can restore this relationship no matter how great the trespass is. Something that the blood of the goats could never do. That the blood of the goats could never, ever do. And so we see here that God is not one who is bloodthirsty, but rather he is showing us, he is reminding us, he is telling us, and he is demonstrating for us that the sin that we have committed has brought about death. And because of that, one who is not us pays the ultimate sacrifice by shedding their blood so that we can be justified in our many trespasses. Now, the next thing here is that we have the two goats, one slayed, the other released. We have this idea and this looking about how the blood works in this whole scenario. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out about how always through this, and if you didn't pick up on it the first time, that's okay. Go back and read through it, and I want you to see about how many times you can find Aaron has to go back and forth across the veils from the Holy of Holies. How many times he has to go out and back in, and all the stuff he has to do while he's going out and in. And it's because there's this veil that has been hung up where Aaron, one time a year, is the only one who can go into the Holy of Holies, because the veil that is pictured here separates the normal, meaning the everyday life, from the holy. The veil separates the everyday normal from the holy. And it's because God dwells past the veil in the temple. We are so used as New Testament believers that we rightfully believe that whenever we trust in Jesus, the Holy Spirit comes and lives in us. And that when the New Testament talks about a temple, it's not talking about the stained glass, although thank goodness they're back, right? It's not talking about the stained glass. It is talking about us as individuals. We are the temple. We are the place that God dwells. If you told that to a Hebrew Israelite in the Old Testament, they'd be like, huh? What are you talking about? God dwells in the Holy of Holies. Like, you've got to do everything right just to approach him. And in fact, there's only one person who's alive at a time in their community who has even seen the entirety of the Holy of Holies set up. And it's because there is this veil. And so Aaron and the priest, the high priest, after Aaron died, has to keep going back and forth across this veil to do all of these things to get these sacrifices taken care of. But if you know from the Gospel of Matthew, that when Jesus gives up the life, when Jesus says, "It is finished" on the cross, what happens? That curtain is torn in two. And it's not just, the fabric ripped. It is symbolizing for the Israelite people, wait, we can see something we have never been able to see before. Like, it's not just like this curtain's gone. It's, whoa, we can access something that we have never been able to access. It's kind of like today. What would you do if I said the doors of the White House have fallen off? Would everybody line up and want to go see the Oval Office? You'd laugh, right? But you get the picture, right? I don't know. I think as a history teacher, I might catch a new flight up to D.C. and just take a few days off and see what happens, right? Because you want to see that. We've seen it maybe on camera, but I don't feel like I've been there. But now, I could go there. And that's what it is for the Israelite people. When the veil is removed, once the veil is removed then, once the acceptable sacrifice is made. And so what Matthew is showing us is that when the curtain of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom, what it's saying is that this system of goats that you have to sacrifice every single year is no longer in effect. Because Jesus has done what the goats could never do. Jesus has made the sacrifice that the goats could never make. And so that's why the veil of the temple is gone, and that we can say that God lives in us and that we are his temple. And then the last thing, I want you to notice there at the end, I want you to notice that whenever the blood they've done with the blood what they have to do, everything that is left of the goats has to be taken outside of the city. That the animal remains are taken outside the city, pointing to the death of Jesus outside the city walls. Have you ever wondered why it is that they have this beautiful city of Jerusalem? And let's acknowledge that Jesus was not the only person that day to die by crucifixion. Why wouldn't they just sacrifice him right there in the middle of the city for everybody else to see? Why was he taken outside the city walls? Why would you have to bleed the goat out, sprinkle his blood, and then take his body outside the city walls? It's because this whole system is not about the goats. It's about rectifying the relationship between humanity and pointing us to Jesus. I guess if we were going to have a t-shirt, we could say it's not about the goats, right? And Hebrews points this out for us. Like if we were reading this, we might say, oh, I don't know about this one. But Hebrews clearly says it. That the reason the body is picked up in Leviticus 16 of the goats and taken outside the city is to tell people your Messiah is going to die outside of this city on this hill where you're dumping the goat. Hebrews says it. It says, for the body of those animals whose blood is brought into the Holy of Holies by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. And then do you know what the writer of Hebrews says about it? He says, for here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Jesus is taken out of Jerusalem. The goat is taken out of Jerusalem to tell us that even Jerusalem is not our final place, that we are looking forward to the eternal celestial city, and only then will we as God's people have a city to dwell in. Do you see that connection? That literally, Aaron is sitting there in this city, in this temple, that the Israelite people think, we have finally made it. We are a people who are God's people. We have been sectioned off from the rest of the world. We have different ways of bathing. We have different ways of acting with each other. We have different ways of clothing. Isn't this great? And God is even saying that whenever they pick up that goat and they take it outside the city, they are saying, as great as this may be, this is not your home. You are looking, Israelite people in Leviticus 16, you are looking forward to the eternal city. People who are watching Jesus die on that cross, and people who walk up to his grave 3 days later and see that he is resurrected. Jesus is reminding them that as great as you may think this is, and as great of a life as you may have here because of the resurrected Lord, this is not your reward. You are looking forward to the celestial city where you don't have to deal with any of this anymore. And that is what the writer of Hebrews says that we should be reminded of whenever we think of the fact that the goats were taken out of the city, that Jesus was crucified out of the city, because we are looking forward to a new city in the new heavens and the new earth. And so this is all wrapped up in this Day of Atonement, of how substitutionary atonement works, how removal of sin works, why it is that God makes sure that the blood has specific things, why the temple is built the way it is with the veils, and why even they have to move the body at certain places and at certain times, because it is pointing to Jesus and it is giving us eternal hope. All right? So we've walked through it. I hope that you will, maybe tonight or tomorrow night or sometime this week, read through it a couple of times and see what other things you may notice. But does anybody have any questions tonight before we get done? Questions, statements, confusion, statements of you're ready to go eat? I don't know. Anything? Yeah. Yes, that's where that comes from. Is that there's literally a scapegoat. The goat. Right, and that's where where this comes from. Is that the scapegoat comes from that goat that was sent out into the wilderness. Yeah. Anybody else tonight? Right.
They have to, take 7 bulls and 6 goats.
Yeah.
A lot of sacrifice.
Yeah, and that's where we got to pay attention. Like as we're reading through, like there's different sacrifices for different things. But when we're talking about the atonement, it's to restore that relationship. Like we started out, there's the burnt offering. There's other types of offerings and other types of sacrifice. Yeah, there's a lot of them, and there's always very clear ways of making sure that this happens. Yep.
I read where when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that's when the sacrificial system completely stopped, and it's never returned. The Jews just basically offer charity prayers.
Right, yeah.
It eliminated, it's never come back.
Yeah, I think there are some various small communities that have tried to revive it, but the problem is they don't have the Ark of the Covenant. And they don't have a temple, they don't have the Ark of the Covenant. And, and it's very clear that, the Ark of the Covenant that has the 10 Commandments in it, there has got to be, specific things done. And so they can't do the sacrifices without that Ark. Which is also why, most sought after treasure in Jerusalem is to find that Ark. And so there's people that's convinced it's still in Jerusalem, and they're scouring. There's this network of tunnels under Jerusalem. They scour them all the time, trying to see if they can come up with this ark because they want to find that again. Yep. But yeah, you're right. Since 87, there has been none. But now they still celebrate Yom Kippur. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
What gets me is the people who sacrifice Jesus for God's chosen people.
Uh-huh.
Here I am, a Gentile, born in South Georgia. I lived in South Georgia, or in Northern Georgia, most of my life. I get it.
Right.
But there's are people who are supposed to be God's chosen people, and they still don't get it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Paul talks about this, how we see almost like in the ways that the veil has been lifted and the veil is still on them. But I think that also, whenever we talk about God's chosen people, we have to ask chosen for what? And it's chosen to bring the Messiah. And that at the end of time, being born of a certain lineage is not going to get you anywhere. It's being born of Jesus the second time, the second birth. The first birth doesn't get you into heaven. The second one does. Right?
Sometimes I wonder, okay, Jesus has come, he's been sacrificed. I don't need you anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about that sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, when we talk about the Israelite people and even the nation of Israel today, as important as they are, they need Jesus. Being born of a certain lineage is still not going to do you any good. when you stand in front of the throne of Christ. And so, yeah. Anyone else tonight? All right, well, if you would, we're going to close tonight with hymn 2.